Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another lecture of Web and Mobile Systems. From today onwards, we are going to start learning about the front-end development framework that is known as React.js. Okay, so React.js is basically a library. Okay, even though we call it a framework, essentially it is a library. It is not an extension of vanilla JS that we had learned in the previous discussions. But it is a separate library which has its own set of syntaxes. And we will talk about the motivation behind why we would like to use React.js in today's class, and then go over the setup with the help of an example of a Hello World React.js project and try to draw some of the similarities of what we have developed in the past in some of the examples that we have worked, like the calculator app, like the quiz app, like some of the basic HTML, CSS projects we have done with respect to developing a portfolio, static website, and stuff like that. And then draw similarities, like if we are trying to do the same thing with React.js, then what are some of the design directives that we have to keep in mind with respect to not just the environment of React.js, but essentially the fundamental design criteria that is involved with respect to React.js, and how to kind of, or how that makes the life of us developers a little bit more efficient with respect to developing a front-end interface or a front-end UI for our clients. Okay, so to start off with, before we even jump into React, we want to kind of revisit some of the projects that we have done and some of the existing practical front-end UIs examples that we see from in our day-to-day life, right? So I want to start off with some practical examples first. And one of the most easiest way to understand that why React.js is useful is to start off with our e-commerce websites, right? So here I am in Amazon.com website, right? And this kind of applies to any e-commerce website that you can think of. So for example, if you want to think of Walmart.com, Target, any of those websites like Best Buy and stuff like that. So all of those front-end designs kind of has the motivation behind using React.js. So let us take this website, for example, first, right? So if we want to break this down into different components, okay, so we can do a quick skim of all of the different components that are present on this website. So you can think of it this way, that the current page or the current landing page that we are in, right, has basically a header section. The header section has two different components, or two subcomponents are present in the header section. One is basically the main header or the banner of the website, which is supported by a search bar. Okay. And then below that, we have a proper navigation bar for the entire website or the web app that you have. Okay. In addition to that, then you have the body of the web page that we see here, and the left-hand side is broken down into different search filters that are made available to us for a specific search that we are trying to do. Unless you do this search, you don't see this particular aspect or this particular feature or component on your web page itself. So let's say if you have done the search, you see all of these filters. And then the other part of the body, that is the other subcomponent that is present in the body of the website, is basically the results of the search that we have done on this particular page. Now, what is important for us to notice is the similarities between the search results in terms of how the components are being rendered and what information is rendered, right? So if you look at it, it may seem that, oh, we are getting different results here. But if you kind of, as a developer, think about what exactly are the information that are being displayed, we can kind of make an item list of what information needs to be shown through the search result along something along these lines, right? So for example, here, the search result, each search result, you can see that there is this very light bordering that is present around each of these search results, and it has some light gray kind of background, right? So that is one thing that we can kind of understand, that each of these search results that is being returned to us and rendered on the interface is kind of enclosed within its own border, right? And we can call these bordered enclosement as cards, okay, CARDS, okay? So these cards essentially on the left-hand side has an image, a thumbnail image of the item that it corresponds to or whatever that you are trying to show. And then on the right-hand side of the card component, if you break it down into something, let's say like a 20% for the image in terms of the entire availability of the section that is there. And then the rest of the 80% is basically with respect to the information related to the product, right? So now if you boil down the information related to the product, right? So the image is kind of similar for all of them, not similar in the sense it doesn't have the same image, but all of the card components have a thumbnail image. That is basically what we are trying to understand, right? And then on the information side, the first information that we have is whether or not this product is sponsored by AWS. So that is the information that will be there in some of the results, but some of the results might not have it. So we can kind of put it into our itinerary list, right? And then right after that sponsored information, which is kind of like a Boolean value, right? So it's either sponsored or it's not sponsored. And then other than that, we have the title of the item that we are trying to display. So the entirety of the title, which is probably saved in some sort of database in the backend, right? And then after that, we have a singular line, and that line consists of three different information. So the first information is the rating, kind of represented using a numerical value. That is what is the review rating. And then that same rating is kind of represented again with the help of these 5 or 6 stars that is given. And that star rating is kind of a representation of the numerical rating, where you have a total of 5 stars, and depending on how many value or rating value that you have received, that many stars are filled out. And then after that, the last piece of component on this particular line is how many users have provided the rating for this particular item, right? So that is basically the second line. So third line, actually, because you have the first line here for sponsored, second line for the title of the product, third line for the rating and how many users have given the rating, and then a graphical representation or a pictorial representation of the rating itself. Okay. After that, we have the fourth line, and the fourth line you can see has the information about the price of the item, the display size, the disk size, the RAM, the operating system. Now, of course, these particular fields will change depending on the type of item that you search on this particular website, right? So that is subjective in nature. But if you kind of boil it down again to some of the basic features or some of the basic attributes that needs to be shown during these search results, is any field that is kind of associated to the product that is being displayed on the interface itself, okay? And after that, in the fifth line, we have whether or not it is eligible for some Prime delivery and stuff like that, which is specific to Amazon.com. And then it talks about when you will get a free delivery if you order it by a certain date, or what is the fastest delivery date, right? So, and then you can see that there is one more information that is not applicable to all of them, which they have this new feature about being climate pledge friendly. But for us as developers, what is important is not the actual data, but how the data is being represented on the front end itself. So if you compare and contrast now, and let's say we take a non-sponsored item for the time being, if we do that, right? If you look at these two items, you can see that there is a lot of similarity with respect to how this interface has been designed, right? So each section has an image, has either the sponsor or not being sponsored, has the title, and the same set of information is there, but it's just that the actual data itself is different for different products. But the design of your interface is kind of pretty similar, right? So there is an aspect of repetition that is taking place when you think of such a website, right? So now if you go to something like, let's say, even if you take this particular landing page of Mozilla Firefox as an example, right? You can see that there is this recommended by Pocket section, which kind of shows you all the different news articles. And instead of having this horizontal card component that we saw on Amazon.com, here we have something along the lines of a rectangular card component, right? And now you can reason with this card component, and you can say that, oh, it has a radius, and that radius is transparent. But here, if you think about it, the radius is a solid line, probably 0.5 or 1 pixel in thickness, and it is a solid line. And then the background color of whatever this section is kind of light gray and stuff like that. Here you can do the same thing. But again, coming back to the design aspect of it, if you compare all of these different cards with respect to its organization, right? Within this card, you have an image which takes up about like 50% of the available space, 40 to 50%. And then you have the link where this article is actually being hosted. Separated by a bullet point, you have this information about how much time it will take to read this article, followed by in the next line, basically the title of the article, and then a short description of the article itself. So if you get the, if you understand the drift of where we are going with this, it's like, whenever you see these practical designs, you will notice that there is some kind of repetition that takes place with respect to kind of rendering different components on the web page. Now we can go on and on about this by going to, let's say, a site like airbnb.com, and then if you go there, you can see that you have something similar again, where you have these header section here at the top, right, which is specific to a particular website, but you still have some sort of header, which has some sort of navigation bar, some sort of search capability, and any other search filters that is specific to that website, right? So you still have something that we call as the header section. And then you have the body section, which is kind of composed of what we call as card components. And these components have some sort of repetitive nature that is present to it, right? Like something like a thumbnail image, the title, rating, description of where it is, dates, price, so on and so forth. So the content may change, but the structuring kind of remains the same. So you can kind of go to youtube.com as well, and you can find something similar that is happening for all the YouTube videos. The same goes for websites such as Spotify. If you go to Spotify, if you go to Apple Music, all those websites. So practically speaking, the organization or the structure of most of the everyday websites that we deal with in our life, or web apps that we deal with in our life, has a very similar pattern that is kind of implemented by the front-end developers or the full stack developers, right? So now the question is, if we understand this design pattern, and if we ask ourselves, what would it take to implement this, let's say by using pure HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, without the help of any other additional libraries, then how would you do this, right? So as far as the navigation bar and the head and body section goes, that is to a certain degree self-explanatory, right? We can look into this, we can go into the developers tool, and we can inspect all of these different elements, right? And then we can kind of understand that what are the different components and what kind of CSS attribute it uses and things like that. And then we can kind of recreate this, at least this header section of all our pages, right? That is kind of easy, right? As long as we find the right icons and stuff like that, depending on the website that we're working on, we can create something similar, right? But when it comes to these main body card components, and if you want to do this using, let's say, static HTML or kind of utilize JavaScript, there will be two different problems that will be coming up for you, right? So let's take the first use case scenario where we're just trying to use HTML to develop something like an Airbnb clone or an Amazon clone, which has these search results that is there, right? So HTML, we always know, or we have already learned, that is all about sequential rendering. So that is whatever you put on the body tag of your pages, one by one, it is going to be rendered on the browser, one after the other, right? So there is no jumping around or anything of that sort. Now, the problem with that is going to be, yes, you can create, let's say for this particular card component, I can probably create a div section, okay, a div container, which is going to be wrapping around that entire thing, okay? And within that div container, maybe I can create an img tag, or maybe I can create another subdivision of within this container, which is going to essentially wrap around, okay, the image tag that will be used in order to host this particular image, right? If you apply some JavaScript to it, you can probably add a button to the image and you can create this slideshow of an image that is being displayed here. That is something that we can enable through JavaScript. But let's say if you're just using HTML, we cannot do a full areas. We need some sort of scripting behavior. So let's, for now, to simplify the design process and understanding where we are going with this, let us say we put one single image. And then after that, maybe we can create another subdivision within this primary division element. And that subdivision will consist of or will wrap around all of the different information that we need to put here. So what we can do is here we have how many information? We have the title for Airbnb. The title is basically the place where the listing is present. And then this star icon and then the user rating, right? So here we can say that, okay, maybe we can use a p tag. All right, and the p tag will wrap around, let's say, a few span tags if you want to style the different texts differently. So the span tag will have probably one for the title of the card information. And then the other two things is that will be wrapping around, or we will wrap around the span tag is basically the star icon and then maybe the rating itself, right? So that is the first component that, or the first HTML element that we will have. And then after that, in a new line, we can create another p tag, which will have the actual location. Okay, and then we can create another p tag, which will have, in this particular case, as we are trying to just recreate what we see on our screen, we can say there is this dates. And then after that, we can do the same thing for the price per night. Okay. So this way we can kind of design the entirety of our HTML element, and this will kind of wrap around the entire card element because this was the primary div element that we had, right? So if we have this, so that means this is the bare bones structure, and then you can push in the content that you actually need to display. So now the problem is, if we are using just pure HTML here, you can see that it's not that it is impossible, but it is completely impractical and it is inefficient. The reason why it is impractical is because, and also inefficient at the same time, is because now if you want to generate this whole page, this is going to start to become a little bit tedious, because what will happen is that I have to wrap this entire page here that you can see, which shows our listing, all of this thing in its own div. So I can say that I need a div for my entire page itself, right? I can give it an ID or I can give it a class name, whatever it is. I need to wrap that whole thing around this particular div, right? So I need to take this and move this div inside the div that will be wrapping the whole page, right? And then after that, for each of these different card components, okay, I have to copy this div and I have to paste it in sequential order, just as I want it to be shown on this particular screen. And I have to keep on repeating this copy pasting action. And then for each of these items, I have to manually insert all of the different image locations, URLs, all of the different titles and blah, 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 all the other information that is there. And then once the HTML is done, I will have to go to CSS. And then in CSS, I will have to pick this up first and then apply to that basically my flex box. Okay, or display flex. So what it will do is, based on the availability of the space for this entire page, it will kind of auto arrange all of these div items within this parent div, right? So the reason, as you should be able to understand at this point of time, if you're developing a very big website, first and foremost, your data is not going to remain static. And what I mean by that is you don't store your data in an HTML file by writing such kind of code. Okay, that is very impractical, and it's also unsecure and it is inefficient as well, right? The second thing is that if you have a very big listing, so for example, let's see how many results, it doesn't say how many results it returns. Okay, so let's say here, if I search for laptops here, it has returned 10,000 results. So this result is dynamic based on what information Amazon has in its database, which is basically feeding into the front-end interface. We don't know how many results are going to be returned. So what happens is that initially, let's say when you are designing the web page using such a design structure or such a design criteria, maybe you have 5,000 different listings. So you create 5,000 different divs, which in itself is a very tedious task, right? And then after that, if somebody comes and adds a new product to, let's say, Amazon, or add a new listing to Airbnb, then we will have to, as a developer, go back to our front-end HTML code, and then we would have to kind of insert these divs again by copy pasting, right? So you should be able to appreciate at this point of time that using the typical fundamental HTML, CSS, working or designing a practical website that we see in our day-to-day life is kind of very impractical and very inefficient, right? So what is the solution to this, right? So how can we make it better, right? So if you think about it, one of the ways that we can make it better is by using the plain JavaScript, right? So let us give some space here so that we can understand this. So let's say we just use vanilla JavaScript. What is the solution to this? So first and foremost, one of the solutions, not solution, but one of the challenges from the previous design criteria that we talked about that it can resolve is basically we don't have to store the data. No need to embed, not store data in HTML files. Okay, that is the first thing that we can resolve. So we can either create a local storage, generally in a full-fledged practical scenario that is not what you're going to be doing. So but essentially what will end up happening is that you will fetch the data from probably some kind of database and then store it into a .js file. Okay, and this is similar to our last exercise where we had stored the question and the options and the right answer into a file called questions or question.js, right? That is a solution that we use for local storage purposes, and we need to send this data back to the or it will be hosted on the user itself, right? But generally, we don't do that because for a very big website or very big application like Airbnb or Amazon or YouTube and stuff like that, you don't want to send the listings data and host it on the client's computer because you don't know if the client's computer has enough space to support 10,000 results, and that will just slow down the entire computer, along with the fact that the browser takes its own memory to kind of execute itself, right? So generally, this is not going to be practical, but let's say for the sake of discussion, since we are not dealing with backends at this point of time or in this course, let's say we bring the data somehow into our JavaScript file, which is going to act as a local storage or a file system-based storage on our website directory, right? So after that, what you can do is you need to figure out a way in which you basically write a singular HTML code, and then you need to go over or kind of iterate over your entire data set. And then you need to kind of embed those information in your HTML file. Now, this is a process that we saw in action when we were working with our quiz app, right? In the quiz app, if you remember, we had 5 different questions, right? And the index.html file where we were trying to kind of embed the quiz questions and the options, we had created a section pretty similar to the div that we are talking about. We had created a wrapper around the question that needs to be embedded. And then we had created a wrapper around the option list that needed to be embedded. And then what we did is we basically went to the JavaScript logic. We found the location where we were trying to embed those questions. So basically around this area, we created a string which was going to be having some HTML syntaxes present in it. And then using the DOM API, we essentially added those strings to the HTML in a dynamic fashion. That is, as the web page has already been loaded and as we are working with it. And then that is the way we kind of generated the entirety of the web page in a dynamic fashion rather than statically coding the questions and options in a static fashion, right, in the HTML file itself, right? So if we use that same way of designing this particular web page that we are talking about, right? These web pages that we're talking about, then essentially what we need to do is we need to take this div page, okay? And then we need to keep this div section, but from here onwards, we need to leave everything empty. So that means the HTML file will look something along the lines of having a primary div section for the entire web page. So we can say web page, this is the div for the entire web page. And then this will wrap around the div for the card components. So here we can say card components. And then around this div, we are going to create two more divs. So one div for our thumbnail. And we will leave this empty, okay? So we will essentially keep this empty because this is where we need to insert our dynamic content. And then there will be another div, which will be with respect to the listing information. So we can say listing info. And then we need to leave this information empty as well. Maybe we can create the p tags if you want to, but we can kind of construct that as a string within our JavaScript file. So once we have done this in our HTML, we need to basically go to our JavaScript file at that point of time. We need to take our data, which is here stored here locally, just for the sake of discussion, but otherwise it will be coming from a database. And then we need to iterate over the data. And then we need to tell JavaScript what to do and how exactly it needs to be done. Now, this is the emphasis. This is the part which has emphasis that if you are doing this with JavaScript, it reduces some of the impracticalities of designing such an interface using, let's say, just plain HTML and CSS, right? We can automate some of the processes, okay? There are some caveats to it, but for now, straightforward. Let's just understand the fact that I can take the data, I can iterate over it, I can leave the areas in the HTML location where this data needs to be embedded, which will change in every iteration. And I can use JavaScript to dynamically populate those contents on my web page. It's perfectly doable, right? But what is important for you to understand here is that if you do it using a technology like plain JavaScript or vanilla JavaScript, you need to tell JavaScript what you want to do, which in this particular case, you would have to iterate over the data, and within each iteration, it will give you an image. It will give you all of this set of information that is kind of present or that needs to be shown in the card component. So that is, and then you need to populate that or embed that in the HTML file that you have associated with this JavaScript file, right? So that is what you need to, what you want to do. So you need to tell JavaScript that this is what I want to do. And then you need to code the entirety of the process that will enable JavaScript to do whatever that is you want it to do. So that means you have to basically code out, explicitly speaking, that you have to, let's say, first create a string, which will have something of an HTML syntax embedding, and then it will have the actual data, so plus actual data. So you will have to create a concatenated string, or you can use string literals using backticks if you do not want to use the concatenation operator in the event of a string, right? And then you need to call the DOM API, okay? Or you basically need to select the HTML element where you're trying to embed or dynamically populate this data. So you would probably have to do something along the lines of document.querySelector. Okay, and then within the query selector, you would probably have to find, or not probably, you will have to find out, let's say, let's focus on this one. So you would do something along the lines of, let's say, hash thumbnail, assuming that this is the ID that you gave to the div. So you would have to do this, and this needs to be stored inside some sort of JavaScript object, and you can say div image container, something like this, something intuitive, so that it makes sense, right? So that is the first step that you have to do. And then once this string has been created, then basically, essentially what you need to do is within this, you will have to do image container, okay? And then you need to do dot inner HTML. assuming that this image is going to be a child of the div thumbnail that we are putting. And of course, this is a child. If you look at this, then this div is wrapping around the image. So this image is basically a child of this. If it is not a child, if it's a sibling, it doesn't make much sense, but you have other methods that are available other than inner HTML. And we had also discussed about that you can use, right? And then essentially assign this string that you have, the string variable, which will have HTML syntax embedding concatenated with the actual data. And the actual data is basically going to be the URL that you're going to be using for our image tag. And this will populate it, right? And all of this operation, that is this steps 1, 2, 3, or I believe this is 2 itself, right? And then this happens for the second one. And then we need to do the same thing for the info. Okay, so that means we have to repeat steps 1 and 2, repeat steps 1 and 2 for info of card component. So we have to repeat this process again. And then we have to take these 3 steps, that is whatever is happening from this first step here to this third step here, but essentially this third step is actually a combination of 2 steps. And we need to repeat this, repeat for all data present in data store. And whatever that data store may be, it could be in the form of a database, or it could be in the form of a local storage embedded within a .js file, right? So this needs to be repeated. Now, of course, this kind of, reduces some of the stress and the inefficiencies that you have in developing such practical websites using plain HTML, right? But the problem here is you need to essentially tell JavaScript exactly how it needs to be done. So that means you have to kind of emphasize, the emphasis is on exactly how it needs to be done, is basically you have to spell out each and every programming step that needs to be carried out in order to kind of achieve the design that you're trying to implement, right? So what React.js helps us, or where React.js comes into the picture, is basically it does the same thing, not the same thing, but in terms of relieving us from the stress of this HTML type encoding, it still helps there, just like vanilla JavaScript does. But unlike vanilla JavaScript, if you tell React.js what to do, you do not have to spell out all the details of how it needs to be done. And that is where React.js makes or is a better option when it comes to designing such practical web interfaces compared to just plain vanilla JavaScript. Okay, so I hope everybody understands how we are moving from just HTML, CSS to just vanilla JavaScript, and then the motivation behind React.js. Okay, so to kind of summarize, okay, the reason why we want to use React.js is twofold. Okay, so the first one, we already talked about it, is that the React language, in what we call it in technical terms, is declarative in nature. Okay, and to understand declarative, you have to also understand what is the other option, or what is the other category. So we have 2 different types of languages when it comes to, or programs when it comes to designing such interfaces. You can either have a declarative language where you tell the code what you want to do, and you don't have to, as a developer, worry about telling that particular program how to do it. Okay, there is another example of this declarative language, which is known as SQL. So if you have worked with databases before, right, if you tell that, hey, I want to read all of the different data records that is present in the database, which has been inserted after, let's say, the year 2016. So that is what you want to do, right? But you don't have to tell essentially, or you don't have to code out exactly how it will be implemented on the low level, right? SQL takes care of that interpretation for you because it is based on that concept of mathematical relations, And then if you're working with relational databases, then it kind of figures out what is it that you're trying to do, and it figures out the how part of it, right? So that is the declarative code. React.js is also a part of the declarative code, right? So you don't have to kind of tell it like, oh, go and select this particular element from the HTML file, and then add the next string that I have created, which has HTML embedding using .inner HTML. You don't have to tell all of those things, right? You just tell that this is where I want to embed this component, and then React will figure out how to do it, okay? The other part, just for your information, or the other type of program is known as imperative code. And vanilla JavaScript is an example of imperative code, right? Because you essentially, in addition to telling it what you want to do, you also need to spell out step by step exactly how vanilla JavaScript needs to do it. And when talk comes about telling it exactly how it needs to do it, basically it is this particular step here where you have to basically select the HTML element and then add the HTML element. So you have to tell it exactly what kind of properties, what kind of methods that you're using in order to achieve your particular goal, right? So that's one of the motivations of behind using React.js. The other motivation that is behind React.js as to like why we should be using React.js is that React is built on the principle of having what we call as composable code. Okay, so that means if you have a very bigger picture, right? So instead of creating that in a single go, right? Instead of, let's say, having a block of stone and chiseling it out to create the image or the figure or whatever that is you're trying to create, instead of doing that, what you do is you create smaller pieces of different components and then bring those components together, those composable components together to create the final picture, right? So now in this example, I can understand that, hey, it doesn't look as pretty as you might find the first one too. But from a developer's perspective, this second option where you can build your final project by bringing together smaller components of your project, which can be kind of integrated together to create the larger picture, that is much more easier when it comes to development compared to having a big picture and then kind of watering down or making it, breaking it apart to kind of achieve the design that you're trying to do, right? So what I mean by this example here is, let's say if you had started off developing this particular web app using just HTML, and maybe let's say you use vanilla JavaScript as well in order to kind of resolve some of these issues of this repeated code or these repeated structures that you have or these patterns that you have on your page, right? But here, what we have to do is, you have to start with the head section or the header section of your page. Then you will have to create this search bar area here. That is the subheader, and then this nav bar. And then you have to move on to this body section of your page. Then you have to create this left side element here, which is like the search filter options. Then you have to create the main body. Then you have to divide your main body into different card components and so on and so forth. And, go approach this as a top-down approach, right? As a top-down design approach that you have to do everything from the start and then continue working on that, right? However, if you think in terms of composable codes, okay, that is, if you think in terms of breaking this design or this website or this web application up into smaller pieces and then bringing those smaller pieces together, you can think of it this way, that let's say you have a team of developers. One of the team just works on this header section of your page and they're not concerned about anything else. One team works about this filter section. They're not concerned about anything else. You are only concerned about creating this card component here and you're not concerned about anything else on the application. And there is somebody else who takes all of these three different components and they just put it together to create this final web page and then just make sure that everything is as it seems to be or as it's supposed to be, right? So if anything is wrong with this portion of the page, right, then that particular developer will connect with the person or the group of persons who are responsible for just developing this component. and they will troubleshoot that and then reintegrate it again. So it is easier to deal with a page like this when you have broken it down into smaller pieces, because at the end of the day, if you think about it fundamentally, the core idea of computer science in terms of efficiency lies in divide and conquer techniques, right? So that means it can improve the process of development if you kind of adopt the process of divide and conquer, right? So you cannot do composable codes in JavaScript as such. I mean, you can create functions and then you can make function calls within that particular JavaScript file, right? Or you can create multiple JavaScript file, put the functions there, and you have to do the import. But that kind of create composable code to a certain degree, but then you are still stuck with the problem that JavaScript in itself is a imperative language, right? So that means you have to spell out each and every detail of how things needs to be done. So even if you can achieve composable code using vanilla JavaScript, you cannot still leverage the complete power of React.js, which is a declarative language, right? So all of these different kind of arguments makes React a very suitable candidate for developing front-end frameworks, right? And one thing to remember, React.js, if ever asked in an interview question or stuff like that, is basically a library. Okay, it's a separate library which has its own syntaxes and stuff like that. Okay, so we will talk about the next thing is what is the language of React. Or before going into that, one more thing is that how React treats. So we talked about all of these different components, right? So one developer works on this component, and all of these different small pieces in a React project is known as a component. So that is another piece of technical wording that you have to keep in mind, that we are talking about composable components, right? Each section or each subportion of the web page that you design, you need to refer to it when you're working within the React environment as components itself. All right, so that is something that you want to keep in mind. And this is the typical syntax of the components, but we will come and cover it again when we work on the demo applications moving forward. So you don't have to worry about the exact syntax. What you have to kind of register at this point of time, for those who are new to this, and many of you are at this point, is that each different portion of your web page will be designed as a reusable component. So that's the word that we use to refer to when we are, as developers, when we are referring to different subsections of the web page. These are reusable or composable components. Okay, so that is what you have to remember. So when we are developing these different components, we work on these individual components, and these components are treated as function calls. So if you want to draw analogies to what is a component when it comes to React.js, so let's kind of make a note of this. So when we work with React, so let us put the motivation. So benefits is essentially with respect to, or making sure that React is a declarative program. So that is the first benefit. Okay, and the second benefit is that React is reusable and composable. And we discussed each of these things. And the way you create reusable and composable design is by designing your website with the use of React components. Okay, and now if you want to draw analogy as to what is a React component, or what do we call a React component in, let's say, traditional programming languages, components are nothing but function calls, right? So that means I will define my components as a function, and then wherever I want to use it, I will call that component. Okay, so that means there are two steps involved when we are designing using React.js. Is basically we will define the component, and then we will call the component wherever it needs to be utilized. Okay, so that means here you can see there is an example on the slide to the left of us, is that let's say you have a body here of your HTML file. This is not exactly how you're going to see it in the actual React, but let's say if you have a body of an HTML element, instead of writing the nav bar in HTML, the main content, and then the custom footer, that is something that we did in the portfolio website, we create these components. And this is the syntax of a component call. So that means when you want to call the component, this is the syntax that you will see, okay, essentially. So if you think about it this way now, in terms of the analogy that we were talking about, that you define a component, which is pretty similar to when you're working with functions in traditional programming languages. You define a function, right? And then you call the components, and that's the same thing that you do. Whenever you need to utilize the logic of a function, you basically execute the function, or the terminology that we use is to call the function, essentially, right? So if we understand this, right, we kind of understand that how these components are being used. So that means if you read between the lines, any properties that is associated to function call to a certain degree will also be applicable to the design criteria of developing components. So that means you can pass in, when you are defining your function, your components, right? You can pass in parameters to these components, just like you can pass in parameters to a function call. So let's say you develop a function call, and let's say in C++, if we develop a function call, we can say something like this, like int sum, int, let's say parameter 1, int parameter 2, okay? And then here, C++, so we have to do this. And then here we can say return, and then we can do P1 plus P2, and then semicolon, something like this. And wherever you want to use this function, you have to call it. So essentially you would have something like int output variable, okay, that is equals to sum, and then you can provide the inputs here, either storing it in a variable or by, providing literal input. So you can do this, something like this, right? So here, these are known as parameters of a function. We know this, right? So just like parameters of a function, if we are saying that analogically speaking, components are defined in a similar way to functions in traditional programming, so that means you can also pass parameters to the components. But we will see later on in React terminologies, we do not call it as a parameter, since just the same way we do not call it as a function, we call it as component. We don't call it as a parameter. What we do call it as are basically props, which is a shorthand notation for properties, but we always call it props, okay? So props are analogically similar to parameters of a function call or a function body. So now if you put everything together, right, some of the information that we just discussed about together, so let's say if you are trying to define this particular website and these particular card components, and you create a component for this, all of this different information will become props. And then when you do the function call, you pass in the exact you want to be displayed for that particular function call. Because I do not have to rewrite my sum, the logic of my sum function. We know that, right? If I want to do a addition of 2 and 5, I can just call the sum, pass it the arguments, and it will be kind of copied onto the parameters here, and it will execute the logic of the function. Okay. Here, when it comes to developing front-end websites, right, or interfaces, the body or the logic of the function is basically whatever you want to render on this page. That is HTML-like syntax. Okay. So you can pass in the props here when you do the function call. Okay. Or you can define the components using the props. And when you do a call to the components, okay, you can basically pass the arguments, which will then be copied to the props and then passed on to the logic of the components itself, right? So that is how these designs are actually implemented. So in the next exercise, after the basic exercise, we will start learning about props, which is our second item agenda for React.js itself. All right. So now let's talk about the language for a second of React.js, right? Because it does not use HTML. It does not use JavaScript. I mean, it does use JavaScript. Essentially, it's a library built on top of JavaScript. But the exact language that is used in order to code all of these behavior is known as JSX, okay? Or the longhand notation is basically JavaScript XML, all right? So what we say is that within React.js, the exact wordings that we use is we write HTML-like code. So we don't write HTML code per se, we write it in JSX language, right? And then in the JSX, whenever we want to use JavaScript, okay, we can use all of the different things that we learned in JavaScript here as well. When I say all of the different things, I only am referring to fundamental JavaScript, okay, and not vanilla JavaScript, because vanilla JavaScript will be taken over by the JSX capabilities. We don't exactly need to use vanilla JavaScript. We have our own syntaxes here in React library, but anything fundamental to JavaScript, such as, let's say, working with variables, for loops, if-else statements, conditional statements, ternary operators, arrays, objects, everything that we have learned in JavaScript, we can essentially use that in addition to JSX. So that is basically the language. And we refer to JSX as writing HTML-like code. So it is not HTML at all. Okay. So then the question should come to you is that, okay, will the browser understand this? Because the browser is capable of opening any kind of HTML file. So it understands HTML. And as a result of that, it can build what we have already learned as the document object model from HTML itself. So how does developing a framework using React.js allows the browser to render a page which looks very similar to as if it has been coded using basic HTML? Well, you need basically a transpiler, okay, not a compiler and not a translator, but a combination of the two, which is known as a transpiler, right? So the transpiler has many different packages that are involved in situations like this, and transpilers are not something which is specific to React.js. It is used in scenarios such as this, when you have the final destination, which is trying to render whatever you have developed, and the language that you have used to develop it, right? So essentially, when it comes to React.js, in order to kind of transform or make the browser understand the JSX syntax, we use two transpilers. Here, one is known as Babel, which essentially enables the transpilation process. And there is another process, which is known as Webpack. Together, this is able to enable, or this basically transforms your JSX codes into something which we call as the React DOM that the browser can understand, right? So here, when it comes to React.js, please keep in mind that there is no longer the concept of a DOM anymore. We don't have a DOM anymore, right? So again, just to do a check here, we don't use a DOM. What we call it as is basically a React DOM, because this JSX language will build the embedded structure, which is an HTML-like code, right? So the DOM that is used is going to be a little bit different from our regular DOM. It is going to be called as the React DOM. You still have the document object model. It's not like the tree structure that is used to represent our web pages has vanished completely, but it is just a different name, because the React DOM is then using these packages are translated to the actual DOM, which the browser can at the end of the day understand and work with, right? So that is the only difference that we have with respect to the DOM structure, right? So those are some of the essential aspects when it comes to working with React.js. So let's now move on to working with our first React application. So you can work with React in two different ways. If you go to the React.js documentation, you can essentially get all of those information. So the first way is the simple way, and the way that we are not going to use, because that is more like, testing out React.js, and you don't have the full flexibility and the capabilities to work with React.js there, right? So first and foremost, I would like to point out the fact that there is this documentation page in reactjs.org. So anytime you are trying to utilize that, or you're trying to refer to any of the different syntaxes and stuff like that, or if you need future help, please, because this is where you will come, and then this will show you all of the different concepts that you need to use. The same things that we have already learned, such as what are components and props. We talked a little bit about it. There's a very important concept in React that is known as state management. So we will talk about it in our second exercise, which is we will do a meme generator app. We will talk about handling events the same way we did in JavaScript, where we did use the method called add event listener. Handling events in React.js is a little bit different because we are not using vanilla JavaScript anymore. We'll talk a little bit about conditional rendering, form elements that we already discussed in HTML. We will revisit that because things are a little bit different in React with respect to the state management and stuff like that. So we will discuss all of those things. In addition to that, we will talk about other stuff as we move forward into React Native and keep on our understanding of React. So coming working or setting up our React project, the first method, as we talked about, is in the form of a content distribution network link, right? A CDN link. So just like we talked about Font Awesome, if you all recall, we embedded a script tag here. So if you do not remember, this is what I'm talking about. So here, if I wanted to incorporate an external library to this React.js is also a library, right? At the end of the day. So if I want to embed an external library within the head portion of my HTML file, I can essentially write a script tag, which can set things up. So that is one option here. You can see it in the styles.css. I also imported, this is CSS specific, but this can also be done in my HTML, that I can use the link tag within my head tag of HTML file, and I can import this font as well, right? So anytime we are trying to bring an external package to our traditional front-end sites, what we can do is either we can use a script tag if it's a script, or we can use the link tag if it's a basic URL, or depending on the relation the link tag supports and stuff like that, and we can embed it there. The only downside is that this will not carry forward all of the different capabilities that that particular package is going to bring to us. Or specifically speaking, in terms of React.js, we will not be able to use the complete features or the functionalities that React.js will provide with us. So I will leave this to you as a self-exercise. What you can do is that you can try to just embed this particular script within the head tag, and then try to see that if you can follow these two slides here, and whether you can write out this particular React.js. What I will go on directly is the more appropriate way of working with React.js, which we call as create React app, right? So that is what we want to do for ourselves. So everybody, you can visit this link here. If you want, I will just, since I have not shared the site yet, so I will just post this link on the Zoom chat. So for all of those who are interested, you can just visit this. Did it just paste it as an image? Can somebody check if you can click on that link? Is that link clickable? Or did it paste?
Yeah, it's clickable.
Okay. All right, so you can visit that and pop it open as a separate window just for some support in case we need it. Okay, so working with it is pretty straightforward. So what we want to do is essentially close all of these files that we don't need at this point. Okay, and so I have a new folder that I have brought into my VS Code here, and I'm calling it as React Demo. And then in the terminal, I have switched into the directory of React Demo. So at this point, this directory is going to be completely empty. And then we are going to go through the process of installing React.js library within this project folder so that we can move forward and understand the different components of the project setup that comes with the React.js library itself. Okay, so in terms of being able to work with React, what is necessary is that you have Node.js installed. It's not specifically Node.js, but we need the npm package manager in order to work with it. So if all of you have tried out Tailwind CSS, then I'm assuming that everybody has npm supported on their local machines, on their computers. So you can simply work with that, right? So the steps that you need to follow in order to install React.js, and this is coming directly from the documentation that I just talked about, is we need to call npx, which is basically saying not just install the package, but compile it as well. Okay, that is the npx part of it in a very high level. So we are not doing npm and then bringing it there. We are not doing npm install. We are directly saying npx And then we are calling this directive that is known as create React app. Okay. And then the last portion of the command is to basically give the name of your app, right? So the name of your app, you can give whatever you want to give at this point of time. Since I have already created a parent folder here, when I give the name of the app itself, it's going to create a subdirectory here, right? And we will see what that means, okay? So let's say if I do npx and then create React app, okay? So again, that is the command that we want to use. And then we need to give it a name. So I can give a, let's say, demo-app. And then just hit enter, and it will take some time and let it do its stuff. So we will give it some time, wait for it to finish, depending on your internet speed, your computer's application and stuff like that. It will do its stuff. Okay, so let's give it some time and let's wait for it. So all of you can go ahead and install this application as well. I'm going to pause the recording for a second until the installation is complete so that we don't add any kind of extra minutes to our recording. So I'll just resume the recording once my loading is done again. All right. So once you are done with the installation of your React app, so mine is still kind of loading. It got stuck here. So hopefully this will in a few more. So let's talk about the next steps that you have to take. The fact that you have created a separate application folder here within your root folder. So the immediate next step that you have to carry out is to change your directory into that new folder that you have created using React app. Okay, this is a very pertinent step. Please don't miss this step. Otherwise, you know, all your working files and stuff like that will be kind of go here and there, and things will become a little bit hard to track. So once you cd into the app, the next command is to start the server. Okay, so we will have a front-end server that will be loading our front-end website, web application this time. So the way we want to start is to just basically say npm start. So once you hit npm start, it will give you this particular prompt. Okay, once you have installed and stuff like that, and hitting npm start on localhost 3000, at least for your computer, you should see this particular screen. All right, so please try that out and get to the portion where you are able to see the screen, and then we will talk about the project directory and the project structure in a little while. So I'm almost 50% done on my side as well. So it's kind of struggling, but it's getting there slowly and slowly as long as it finishes. So when you go there, did you get this screen here for those who have installed it?
Yes.
I have as well.
Okay. Right.
That's good.
Good. Okay. So let's talk about what the directory structure will look like. I think I have not changed it from my previous time. Give me 1 second. How about you? I have already cleaned you out. I've cleaned you out as well. Okay. So if you look at the directory structure of your local setup, right? So this is the app that we have already created. If you don't want this app, you would have to open a VS terminal on your root directory or wherever your workspace is, then create this app and then open VS Studio Code in that. So that means what I'm trying to say here is you don't essentially have to create a folder added to your VS Studio Code as a workspace, right? As a folder directory, and then run this npx create React app my app command. You can essentially do it before even starting VS Code using your regular terminal. Okay, and then you can directly open your Visual Studio Code and add that folder. So that way you wouldn't have this two-tiered directory structure that you see that we have created here. All right. So as far as the content of the actual structure goes, or the actual project directory goes, you have the node modules directory, which essentially stores all of the installed packages that has been brought in with the React.js libraries. So everything that you need in order to work with React.js is at this point of time installed in node module. Okay. In addition to this, if you need any additional third-party libraries in addition to React.js, whatever you install will be collected in node modules as well, right? Also, since we have brought in an external library to create this project directory structure, so React.js is an external library, we will have a package.json file. Okay, so that package.json file, I think we have already seen the excerpt of package.json before when we worked with Tailwind CSS. So it will consist of all of the different information with respect to React.js. So you can read this through. It also gives you certain scripts. So remember when we wrote npm start in order to start the React server, it actually means that we are executing this command. So we are executing npm react-scripts and then space start. So when you think of package.json file, the script section, we are creating some shorthand notations of the commands that we want to essentially run. Okay. In addition to that, whenever you will be adding some more packages to this particular project, that will be added here, depending on whether you are adding it as a development package or whether you're adding it as a production environment package, right? So there are two different categories of packages that we can essentially add. We don't have to worry about production development at this point of time. Let's focus on actually getting the project done first, okay? It comes with a git ignore file as well, no doubt about it, because you don't want to push essentially your node modules folder up to GitHub. You just want to push your package.json file. In addition to that, React.js also kind of lists the folders, even if it is not there, which it should not be pushed to React.js. Okay, so other than that, okay, so my installation is done, so I don't have to deal with this part anymore. All right, so the next step, our installation is done. And the way we know that installation is done is when we see this last message here, which is known as happy hacking. And then it will kind of return our control to the location where we are. So next, what I want to do is basically cd into my app. That is where I have all my React.js folders that we were talking about. So the same thing. The other two things that I have not touched upon yet is the two working directories that we have to host all of our files that we have in this particular project is basically the public subdirectory. So the public subdirectory is something that is available to the public, as the name suggests. This is similar to our build directory that we did, or the prod directory that we did in Tailwind CSS, depending on what you named it. And then SRC, or the source folder, which actually consists of all our essential working files, right? So in the source folder, our landing page is always going to be this index.js, okay? And then the first subcomponent, or the first component that React.js creates for you. So remember, we had this long discussion about components, right? So React.js creates one basic component for you, which is known as app.js. If you don't want to use it, that's fine, but it already creates it. So app.js, basically, you can think of it as the landing page for your application's logic, and then you can add more subcomponents to it in order to render that out, all right? And then for each of this index.js and app.js file, React.js also provides you with a default CSS file that is associated to each of them. The beauty of this is that just like you can compose the different components on your web design or on your web interface, you can also create individual CSS file that will be associated to all of this. If you do not want to go through all that hassle of creating an individual file, CSS file for each and every component that you create, although that is a good organizational structure sometimes, depending on what type of project you're working on, what you can do is you can either create a solo app.css, since the entirety of your app logic will be present here, or you can create a solo index.css for your landing page, and then that index.css will be linked to everything else that you're working with, right? So we did this, and let me just do my npm start as well, which will start the local server for React.js. And you can see here, because of the package.json file, it kind of opens it here. So this will start, and I will see the same page here, depending on the files that I have. And there you go. You have your first React project set up, right? Again, please remember, during the installation process, if it takes a little bit longer than what you anticipate, and you know that it is taking a little bit longer, stop the process, run it again, right? Sometimes restarting actually does do the magic, contrary to the memes that they show in that. There's actually a joke. Somebody was like, somebody had a heart attack or something. Somebody went unconscious on a bus, and then the public shouted, "Is there a doctor?" And one of the guys gets up, and then they say, "Yes, I'm a doctor." And she's like, "Oh, this guy fainted. What should we do?" It's like, "I'm a doctor of computer science. Have you tried restarting the person?" Uh, essentially, that's the joke. It's a bad one. I've always found that funny. Anyways, so everything that you design within your React.js or your landing page. Let's talk about the landing page first. Everything is about writing functional components in React, right? So your entire project setup is reliant on functional components. Okay. In addition to that, in your landing page, you need two packages that is very important before you can work on any of React components, right? So I will just separate it, okay, based on the importance of the different files that we have. So this is basically index.js. This is your landing page. So the two things that we absolutely need anytime that we are working with React components, okay, is we need React itself. So this statement, what it is doing is it is taking this package, which is React, that is installed in some node modules subdirectory or folder, but we don't care about that part. We are bringing that entire package inside the object called React. So anytime that we want to use any kind of utilities of the React package, we will essentially use this object and the methods and properties that are associated with it. So that is the first package that is absolutely necessary. That is the starting point or the landing page of our React projects. We need that. That's the first package. The second package we need, as we talked about the fact that since React uses what we call as JSX syntax, which is HTML-like code, not HTML, then we need some way to have the browser understand that these different components we are building and then render it out on the web page, right? So for that, we essentially need this React DOM. You can just simply do React DOM. You don't essentially have to do React DOM/client, but you can keep it as such, the default behavior. But all you need to remember is you need to bring in this React-DOM. And you need to bring it inside this object that we will call it as React DOM, React DOM. So that is what we need, okay? So these are the two basic inputs that is absolutely necessary, all right? If you need any kind of other third-party packages later on when we work with React Native and other stuff like React Router or React Redux, we will do the import statements just like this. That is, we will specify the package here after the from, and then we will import that into this object, and then we will use this object throughout our program or in this file in order to work with the properties and the methods that is available to us in that particular package. Any other import statements, such as JavaScript files, CSS file, image files, and those kind of sort, okay, and all those things. So here we can say that this is a SVG file, which is an image file, essentially, or a category of image file. Here we can see that there is an import for a CSS file, and this is an import for another JavaScript file, which essentially is our, let me minimize this, which essentially is this app.js file that you see here. So that means any file imports, JavaScript file imports, any image import, any other import, you just simply say import and then specify the name of the file. If you want any specific component within that file to be stored, then you have to do an import statement, which is similar to this. That is, you need to bring that into an object within this particular file, right? But if you want to just connect the file to this entire project, so to speak, in a manner of speaking, all you do is just say import, and then as a string, you provide the file name with the proper path, okay? So here, when I'm bringing a particular component from this file, I need to store it in the object. So let us quickly go ahead and look at how do we export it from a file so that it can be imported in another file. We talked about this a little bit last time, but you can see here that when this function has been created, at the very end, the termination of this particular file is with the statement saying export default app. The default part, again, because this is the only component that is present in this entire file. If you had multiple functions here, then you do a default export, because you have to specify what exactly are you trying to get out of here, or get outside of this file, right? So this is the app that we have. So if we want to use just this app here, what we are doing is we are importing from that file, and this file is essentially saying that I'm exporting this app function that I have created, and then I'm storing this into this object. So essentially, whenever I want to make a function call, I will refer to this. This structure of import and export is pretty useful, and it helps to understand this so that we can keep on using this as we go forward. All right. This import is at this point of time essentially useless. So you can just comment it out. What it essentially keeps a track of the performance of the application and stuff like that. So if you want to get a log of the results of how your website is performing, the analytics, blah, 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 you essentially use this package, bring it in as an object, and then make a function call so that it can give you that analysis. So we don't need that at this point of time. So you can just save it. If your thing crashes, it will say it did not compile successfully, and then you will not see this. You will get some error message here, but that's essentially how you're going to keep a track of whether your changes have broken your project or is it still good and stuff like that. All right. So the last piece of information is how you are actually doing the print statement, in a manner of speaking, because remember, the final piece of information is to actually display something. Like, so if you're in Python or something, you do something like this and you say print hello world, right? But how is the hello world essentially working here? That is a very important structure or important syntax that we have to understand. And the trick here lies in the index.js file, which is the landing page of our React.js application. So what we have to do is we have to first use the React DOM object, okay, which is basically the structure that will be used to be translated and rendered on the web browser. And we have to call a method that is known as create root, because remember, this is a DOM structure. React strictly follows that DOM structure. So we have to be always mindful of that. And here I will give you a piece of information that you should store it somewhere, memorize it if necessary, because it is a source of a lot of bugs for beginners. We face this bug a lot, that each component must return, not should, must return a single DOM element. Okay, please remember this information by heart for beginners. When you practice it, you will understand what is happening. And what I mean by this is, let's say I have a component. I will just give you one example. And let's say this component returns me a div, and then it returns me a p tag, and then it returns me an image tag. All right. So that means this component here is returning 3 different DOM elements. This is not allowed. React will throw an error here, and your program will essentially crash at this point of time. Okay. And this is the source of a lot of frustration for beginners, because we forget, because we are used to dealing with HTML. There is nothing wrong in HTML writing a file like this, right? But in React, it will throw an error. So what you need to do is you need to, if you have to, in a situation, return multiple DOM elements back from a component, you need to wrap it up in a parent div, like a container, such that whatever is returned from this component is a single DOM element. Inside of this, you can write your multiple DOM elements. There is no problem and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, each component must return a single DOM element, not multiple DOM elements one after the other time. So that means every component must have a singular root. And that kind of is aligned with the idea of a data structure of a tree, is that a tree necessarily doesn't need to have multiple roots. Okay. A forest can have multiple roots, but a tree, it has a singular root. So that is something that you have to remember. Okay. So with that out of the way, what we do is we create the root, and when we create the root, in the parameter, we have to specify what element is going to act as the root. So what we are going to say is that since this React.js script is at the end of the day still connected to an HTML file, okay, which is here in our public directory, it's called index.html. So all we have is basically this head information, but this is the body. if you notice here, the body, all it has is just a div. And that is the beauty of React DOM, is that you're not going to see the entire page. You're going to see a div. And then within the div, you will see the other stuff. So it's very hierarchical in that nature, right? So when I create this, all I create is basically this div, give it an ID of root element, because this is going to become the anchor element of my entire page. And this is the entirety of the content that you will have in your index.html file. Okay, so now you can understand where this document.get element by ID and then root is coming from. This is vanilla JavaScript using the DOM API. But what this is essentially doing is that it is telling, using React DOM, that for this React project, this particular div element that we have in the HTML page will act as the anchor element for our entire project. Okay, so that is what this line statement is essentially doing. Now, once this root has been created, we need to use the method called render. And then within the render, we need to pass in all of the component calls, or the function component calls, functional component calls that we have created in our project. So we talked about the fact here, if you remember, that this header portion can be a component, this vertical portion here can be component, these individual card portions can be a component. So now we have to insert these components into this root element that we have created, right? Such that that can be dynamically inserted into the HTML eventually when it gets rendered on the browser, right? So that means we are taking the root, we are calling the render method, which actually is going to facilitate the rendering. There is this additional statement here that is called React strict mode. Not necessary, don't worry about it right now. Pay attention to this syntax here, which is essentially calling this app component here, which has been imported or essentially exported from the app.js file. So right now, what I can do here is essentially go to app.js and kind of change the structure here. And what each component is going to return is basically, it will have a return statement. If you need to do any kind of variable declaration here, or if you want to write any JavaScript code, that will come before this return statement, because what is happening inside of this return statement is basically JSX code. So any JS code before return and after or within and within return, you have JSX code, right? And the JSX code, you can see that it looks pretty similar to HTML. I'm creating a div, giving it a class name. By the way, please notice that it is no longer called class as we are familiar with in HTML. It is called class name, because class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript to indicate you're creating a class. So you have to be careful about reserved keyword policies as well. The same goes from typical programming languages. You cannot use reserved keywords. So here the class becomes class name. Okay, we give it a class name, then we have a header section which has a class name. We're putting in some images, and anytime within JSX code, if you see a piece of code that is wrapped within these curly brackets, then the piece of code inside those curly brackets is plain JavaScript or fundamental JavaScript. It is not JSX. So that is another note that you want to make essentially, is that if you have within a JSX syntax any piece of code that is wrapped by curly braces, then that is not JSX anymore. That is just JS. I know it's a little bit confusing at this point, but just write it down somewhere so that you can remind yourself. All right. So we do all of these things, which looks very similar to HTML, but please notice that this piece of code that we have written, and again, please notice that here we are returning only a single DOM element. You can see here we have a header, image, paragraph, anchor, but we are not returning all of this. We are wrapping it inside a singular element, DOM element, and then we are returning that DOM element back, right? So that is what I was referring to. And the last piece of information before we wrap up for today is the fact that this code may look like HTML, may behave like HTML, but it is not HTML. This piece of code that you see inside the return statement of a function is basically JSX syntax. And any piece of code inside JSX syntax that is wrapped by curly brackets is JavaScript syntax. So we will treat it as JavaScript. So all we are doing here is basically taking this variable, which stores this image, and we are embedding that as the URL for the source code, so we don't have to spell it out in its entirety, right? So that is the difference. So this is the typical structure. So you have a public folder, you have a source folder. The source folder, index.js, is your landing page. In the public folder, index.html is your landing page. For any kind of React project, your HTML body will only have a single div and nothing else. That will be connected to your index.js file, and you will create what is known as a root element, which will be a part of the React DOM and not the regular DOM. And then within the root element, you will use the render method, and then you will make function calls. Please note the syntax here of how the function call is done. After you have imported that function from wherever that function is defined, and when you define that function, you basically have a return statement within a function. That is typically how functions are. And within the return statement, you write your HTML code as is, but be careful about some of the reserved keywords that is there in JavaScript that you cannot use. And then any kind of code that you write within the return statement that is wrapped in curly brackets is basically fundamental JavaScript, right? And at the end of the day, these functional components that you declare needs to be exported such that they can be called from index.js file. So that is the fundamental structure of React.js. So in the next class, we will start working with our first example of React.js, which is the Airbnb clone application, right? So we will look into the Airbnb online experiences web page interface, and we will try to develop that using React.js again, right? So I will wrap up the recording here for now. Please do practice it. Please do go over. We have covered a lot of conceptual aspects of React.js. It is very necessary. So go over the slides. I will share it up, all the slides available on React.js. So at least go through the first exercise, try out some of the self-practice exercises that I have listed. And then please get confident or comfortable with this new environment that we have started. Once you understand this, it is going to be a beautiful journey, so to speak. Okay, so I'll wrap up here and I will see you online again on next Tuesday. Thank you.